This continent is home to one of the oldest participatory democracies on the planet. In the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, women have had a political voice and lived in a system of real equality for 1,000 years. Ben Franklin was interested in the structure of the Confederacy and the great law of peace upon which their system is based. While John Adams was working with the Continental Congress, his wife Abigail wrote to him with a plea. In the new code of laws, I desire you would remember the ladies. If particular care and attention are not paid to the ladies, we are determined to foment a rebellion, and will not hold ourselves bound to obey any laws in which we have no voice or representation.
It wasn't a perfect document. It allowed for the inhumanity of slavery and failed to guarantee women, and even men who didn't own property, the right to participate in the political process.
The struggle for the vote is a struggle for self-determination, for a say in what happens in our country, our communities, and our bodies. It's a struggle for our democracy. Our democracy isn't fully formed yet. We're still working on it. Big milestones have been reached, and yet threats to our voting rights mirror those of 100 years ago. The movement for women's equality began with the female anti-slavery organizations. Anti-slavery societies grew rapidly and formed into a national organization.
In 1848, some women and men met in a very, very small little town, Seneca Falls, and they wrote a Declaration of Human Sentiments. The Declaration of Human Sentiments was modeled on our own Declaration of Independence, and it was very, very simple. They said, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men and women are created equal. They are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness."
After the kickstart from Seneca Falls and subsequent conventions, the decade of the 1850s saw the movement grow with national conventions nearly every year. The conventions focused on multiple areas of women's rights. In 1865, the Civil War ended, slavery was abolished, and groups that had focused on abolition shifted their attention to suffrage and rights. The American Equal Rights Association, AERA, was formed calling for universal suffrage for men and women. But as the 15th Amendment was being debated, suffrage groups split over priorities. Some of the white women felt they should get voting rights before the African American men. The 15th Amendment was ratified in 1870. Some states began crafting laws that would limit the ability of African Americans to register or cast ballots. Groups like the KKK also used violence to keep them from voting. The AERA was now divided on strategy and broke into two groups. Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony led the National Women's Suffrage Association, which focused at a national level on a federal amendment. Lucy Stone and Henry Blackwell led the American Women's Suffrage Association, which worked on state-by-state voting rights. In 1890, they remerged as the National American Women's Suffrage Association. Increasingly discriminatory practices made the work of black women suffragists much harder. They spoke out and worked within suffrage organizations and outside of them. African American women were working together in clubs, churches, and organizations for advancing and empowering their communities. In 1896, the National Association of Colored Women was formed. Their slogan was "Lifting as we climb." In the 1910s, they worked for the suffrage amendment, and after the 19th Amendment was passed, they helped women learn to navigate the voting process. The 1900s were slow in terms of progress, but a new generation of suffragists was getting impatient and had different ideas about moving the campaign ahead. Alice Paul and Lucy Burns organized an enormous parade in Washington, D.C. in March 1913. This was the first large organized march on Washington for political purposes. The parade was massive, with 5,000 to 10,000 marchers, 26 floats, 10 bands, chariots, mounted brigades, and more. There were sections for countries where women already had the vote, for various professions, and floats with relevant themes. A pageant was performed on the steps of the Treasury building. A rally at the end featured known speakers, including Helen Keller. Although there were police escorts, the enormous crowd surged into the parade, blocking the way. Spectators were mostly men, and many were hecklers, spitting, throwing things at marchers, and flicking lit cigarettes at them. Some people were trampled. About 300 people were hurt, and over 100 were sent to the hospital. The event generated much talk. Hearings were conducted to learn why the police had let the crowd get out of hand. Alice Paul and Jane Burns formed the National Women's Party, which kept up pressure with picketing and marches. Their Silent Sentinel was groups of women who stood at the White House gates and then in Lafayette Square in front of the White House starting January 9, 1917 until June 4, 1919, when the 19th Amendment was passed by both houses of Congress. Their protest was silent. Nearly 2,000 women participated in the Silent Sentinel. They got support from some people who would bring hot drinks or contribute money, but they also endured harassment, arrests, and physically abusive treatment. As many as 500 people were arrested. November 14, 1917 became known as the Night of Terror, when police arrested 33 women, treated them brutally, and sent them to Occoquan Prison. A D.C. Court of Appeals later ruled that they had been illegally arrested, convicted, and imprisoned.
When the suffragists were stopped at the state level, they went to the federal level. When they were stopped at the federal level, they went to the state level, and they kept it up. For 56 state referendum campaigns, 480 legislative campaigns, 470 state constitutional campaigns, 277 state party campaigns, 30 national party conventions, 19 campaigns, and 19 successive Congresses. They kept it up, and they kept it up until suffrage was theirs.
The 19th Amendment said that the right to vote can't be denied based on sex, but it didn't guarantee access to voting, and many states still put roadblocks in the way of voters. The NAWSA and National Women's Party considered their work complete, but black women were now on their own to ensure their voting rights. People like Fannie Lou Hamer put their lives and safety on the line to fight for the right to vote and participate fully in our democracy. She experienced the repeated obstacles that prevented her from voting, but she persisted. She testified before Congress about the near-fatal police brutality she experienced when arrested on a bus trip with other activists to the Southern Christian Leadership Conference in South Carolina. Her testimony captured the nation's attention, and she continued to organize voter registration drives and work for voting rights. Her efforts and others contributed to the drive for passage of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. In 2013, the U.S. Supreme Court rolled back voter protections in the Voting Rights Act in the Shelby County v. Holder decision. Attacks on voting rights since that time include rollbacks to early voting, unjust voter purges, and strict photo ID laws that make it harder for young people, women, people of color, and individuals with low incomes to register and exercise their right to vote.
There are many legacies of the 19th Amendment to explore, and much more work to do, not only for the benefit of women, but also, of course, for the benefit of our entire democracy. We must overcome the barriers to full democratic participation. We must achieve full enfranchisement for those who, by law, currently have the right to vote, and others who, in a just society, should have the right to vote. While the 15th and 19th Amendments meant that voting rights could no longer be denied because of race or sex, many voters still face ballot restrictions. New constructs evolved, some by misguided, if not malignant design, to strip away the right to vote from otherwise eligible persons. Other challenges continue today, including accessibility to polling places for people with disabilities.
The quest for the women's vote has been an effort by thousands of women and men over generations.
It has to be said that the voting booth is the one place on earth where the single mom and the corporate executive are equal, where the very richest and the very poorest are equal.
We should make every effort to assure that people who want to vote get the chance to vote.
So we have to get busy by voting like never before.
When we vote, things change. When we vote, things get better. When we vote, we address the need for all people to be treated with dignity and respect in our country.
I would like to show my granddaughters that the equal citizenship stature of men and women is a fundamental human right. It should be right up there with free speech, freedom of religion, ban on discrimination based on race or national origin. So I think, our Constitution says we the people, in order to form a more perfect union, the union will be more perfect when that simple statement that men and women are persons of equal citizenship stature is part of our fundamental instrument of government.